Mechanics of Reddit. What's the dumbest thing you've seen someone do to their vehicle? Story 1 had a customer once who had their oil light come on and couldn't figure out how to top the oil up. He thought it might have worked like his boat motor, so he poured a jug of oil in his fuel tank. Story 2, the list is long. Removing PCV hose, assorted vacuum lines, O2 sensor, etc., thinking they're going to get better performance, cutting a wire under the dash to hook up a stereo, then bringing the car to me to fix the taillights, pouring 3 quarts of oil in, but the dipstick still shows low because they put the oil in the radiator. Putting gasoline in a diesel truck, again. Story 3, did a co-op at a shop back in high school. Guy complains about how his car doesn't sit straight. We pull it in and don't even need to put on the lift to realize that he has 17-inch rims on one side and 15s on the other. Took me about 45 minutes of explaining to him why cars aren't made like that before he told us that he'd be taking his business elsewhere. On a side note, the side with the 15s were 100 bald, like racing slick bald, and everything in that car was falling to pieces. I have too many stories I found in people's cars there, but this one has to be my favorite. Story 4, let me tell you about Diamond Plate Guy and Focus Bro. Diamond Plate Guy had 2 things he used to modify his truck: a drill and a ton of diamond plate. It was an absolute base model V6 Ram 1500 with the exhaust chopped off, which I thought was bad enough until I opened the hood. He had drilled or glued diamond plate to every flat surface. Air filter box, intake manifold, fan shroud, etc. This was 18 months ago. My eyes still haven't recovered, but this isn't the end. He had some crappy wheels that he had painted white himself. I know this because he painted the inside of the wheel where it seats to the hub, which caused them to seize to said hubs. I literally had to buy a bigger hammer to smack them off. Focus Bro Guy had a custom straight pipe, full Sparco race seats, 5-point racing harnesses, lowering springs, and a base model automatic Ford Focus SE. Story 5 worked as a car cleaner at a dealership one summer in high school. Guy towed in a relatively new, top-of-the-line Corvette he had bought there sometime before I started. He was pissed that it had died on the road and been running like before that. Ranting and raving about he spent all this money, and it only went X months years before completely breaking down. One of my work buddies got it up on a lift and started looking it over. He opens the oil drain plug and nothing comes out. He pulls apart the engine and the oil could now be best described as glue. Owner talks to the guy and asks when the last time he changed the oil was. Guy had zero idea what he was talking about. He had no idea that you had to do that. He assumed you just added gas, and that's the only thing you needed to do. The engine was a complete loss, which meant the car was a complete loss to him. Edit clarification. Story 6, I was working at a performance shop at the time, 2010. Golf GDI comes in for lack of power, and throwing check engine codes for underboost, and several for fuel trim management conditions. Did the typical process of checking the turbo wastegate operation, pressure and smoke, tested the charge side of the turbo system for leaks, tested fuel pressures, all checked out, removed the intake side from the turbo to inspect for rips in the rubber boot. All good. Looked inside the intake boot, and this moron bought one of these turbinator gimmicky things and put it inside the intake. It had turned completely on its side and was restricting 80 of the airflow. Removed the obstruction and motor operating values returned to normal and power was restored. Did not feel any guilt that this idiot had to pay a few hundred for me to diagnose and remove his awesome DIY performance mod. Story 7, dudes spending thousands of dollars modifying their pickups for off-roading, even though they spend 99 of the time on highways, and the furthest off of a road they ever get is a logging road that a stock Forester could tackle with no problems. And then complain about extra shitty fuel mileage, and having to pay for new 35-inch knobby tires that only last 10K miles because they wear out super quickly if you drive mostly on pavement, and having to replace their front wheel bearings every other year because those larger wheels and tires are a lot heavier than the stock ones, and being super surprised to learn that parts for a 34-ton pickup can cost multiple times more than the comparable ones for the small sedan they sold to a Ford. Their bro truck. Story 8, this probably won't be the worst one in this thread. I used to know a 30-year-old who would put the car air freshener duct taped outside the exhaust, kind of just dangling in front of the opening. His logic was it makes the exhaust smell better for pedestrians. Story 9, I bought my car off a guy for $785. For all intents and purposes, it worked fine, but the guy said that it overheated almost daily. 1999 Nissan Sentra, manual, 135K miles. If it didn't overheat, it would have been closer to 3 to 4K, maybe even more. I bought it anyways, because I could try fixing it, and because I was desperate for a car. My old one died, and I lived 10 miles from work, so I brought the car home. The guy filled the radiator per an agreement we made, and the overflow tank was already empty. I started feeling along the coolant piping, and when I came to the thermostat sensor housing, I could stick my fingernail inside the gap. My fingers came out soaking wet with coolant. Went to a parts store, spent 10 on a housing gasket, 3 on some liquid gasket, and 50 on new oil, a new oil filter, and new air filter, radiator cleaner, and coolant. Spent an entire day putting that gasket, and the reason it took so long is a frickin' story and a half that was all about Murphy's Law. Changed the oil, cleaned out the radiator, and I haven't had any trouble since. All in all, a perfectly working car for about $850. I kind of feel bad for the dude who sold it to me. Edit. So if you're satisfied with the story, stop here. The Murphy's Law story. The housing is underneath 2 solid pipes that are part of the AC system, which means that on top, I have about 2 inches of space to work with, and underneath is so curved that only my skinny wrists will fit. No tools. There are 3 bolts, 1 on top, 2 on bottom, and my socket wrench could only move 1 click at a time with some fighting. Getting the bolts out took 10 to 15 minutes each. I put the housing gasket in, closed it, and tested it, still leaking. So I unbolted it back up, applied liquid gasket to either side of the physical foam gasket, and finger tightened it. Then you have to wait an hour for the liquid gasket to dry before tightening it all the way. After the hour, I went to tighten the bolts, got one, got the second. I turned the third 4 times and snap. It seared right through the threading inside the housing. So I had to unbolt it back up, scrape off the now ruined gasket. Luckily, it came in a pack of 2, and get the bolt out. The bolt was sticking out 1 thread. I grabbed a set of needle nose pliers, the only thing that would fit, and began the painstakingly slow process of turning the bolt with the pliers, 2 inches of space at a time. It took half an hour. Luckily, my old, now dead car used the same bolt, so I snagged one off of it. While I was at it, and already pretty frustrated, I went and rummaged around for another half hour before finding a bolt screwdriver that was the exact right size to fit under the piping, and at least mostly tighten the bolts. Putting the entire setup together, the third time, took 20 minutes plus waiting time for the liquid gasket to dry. Story 10. Bad snow day. For whatever reason, we were open. Guy pulls up needing a flat repair. He pulled up in a way the car could be just pulled in. Co-worker goes to pull it in and can't stop. Slams in his box. Wasn't going fast enough to damage anything. Car had 0 brakes. Say something to the customer over the foot brake. That hasn't worked in years. You have to use the handbrake. We inspect the vehicle and discover it doesn't even have brake calipers in the front, with the hoses clamped off and not an ounce of brake fluid in the master cylinder. And the most surprising part, they didn't want to get the brake repairs done. Edit. Typos. Holy gold. Thank you, kind stranger. Story 11. Not a mechanic, but we do almost all of our farm equipment maintenance. Brother called during a hellacious snowstorm telling me, hurry, get over here and bring beer. I arrive with Bud Light in hand. He's got 2 lawn chairs under his carport. We get a beer and settled in our chairs out of the snow. We commenced to watching his meat-eat-out neighbors that are higher than kites push this Mustang. They're trying to push start it. After about 10 minutes, we're hysterical. They had been trying for almost 2 hours. It was an automatic transmission. Story 12. Not a mechanic, but former service writer. Woman comes in for an oil change, some common minivan. Nothing out of the ordinary. Walked by the van while it was up on the rack and noticed one of the tires was nearly bald in the middle. Cords showing, textbook overinflation. I checked the tire pressure was well overinflated. Then looked around the vehicle. 2 more tires were in exactly the same state, overinflated and showing damage from it. The 4th was a bit underinflated, no glaringly obvious tread, where pointed it out to the customer when she came back. Asked if there's any reason 3 tires would be overinflated. Long story short, she was occasionally seeing a low tire light on the dash, no indication of which tire. Just low tire, told her husband, and he just aired up all 4 tires. Happen again, fix the same way, rinse and repeat. So over time they kept the tire with the leak going, but managed to ruin the other 3. Buy a tire pressure gauge if your car doesn't give you per tire pressure readings. Story 13. The previous mechanic didn't know how to patch an exhaust leak, and had tried to weld a Rockstar can around the leak. The leak caused the second oxygen bank to fail, which is why they tried to patch it with a can. Not a week later, the bank read a failure again. Story 14. Not a car mechanic, but I knew a guy who used self-tapping screws to fasten a roof rack to his car. A few people have asked if it worked. Yes, but it leaked. I would not recommend it, though, because the roof sheet metal probably doesn't have much load-bearing integrity. Story 15. Not a mechanic, but a car enthusiast. Saw a couple of cars where owners didn't know what basic maintenance was like. No oil change, no brake pad change. The oil turned into jelly, and you had to scrape it out. The most ridiculous thing were the brakes. My mechanic friend showed me the brakes of an elderly lady's car. The brake discs were gone, like almost completely wiped down to like 5 to 6 millimeters. She said to him, the car feels weird while I brake. Story 16. She didn't actually do anything, but a girl in my school noticed her check engine light came on, and she wasn't sure what to do, so she started asking around. Teacher told her to take it to a mechanic and have him look at the engine. She goes, okay, where's the engine? Without missing a beat, teacher responds, that compartment in front of the passenger seat that opens up, glove compartment, really, The whole thing ended with a class trip outside her car, where the teacher opened the hood to show her the engine. She asked which thing in there is the engine. My poor teacher used to work on classic cars, and am very sure he wanted to die. Story 17, a customer brought their vehicle to the dealership I used to work for an airbag recall. They had bedazzled everything on the interior dash, including the covers for the airbags on the steering wheel and on the passenger side. I'm not sure she understands the fact that airbags have enough power to turn anything into shrapnel. Story 18, oh, finally a chance to tell my story. He'll keep it short. Guy comes in with a Kia Soul for an oil change. Mentions when he tries to pass people on the highway the engine bogs down. Doesn't want to pay for diagnostics, so I just say, well, see if the visual check included in the oil change brings anything up. This guy put some aftermarket turbo kit, and that was just a big fan attached to his throttle body. When he was at WOD, it would close the circuit, and the fan would blast air into his engine. Only he wired it backwards. The fan would turn on, spin the wrong way, and the engine would starve for air. Update WOD is wide open throttle for the uninitiated. Means when the gas pedal is to the floor. Story 19, not a mechanic, but I knew a guy who had a Mini Cooper who modified it to ride only an inch or two off the ground, without air ride suspension, to the extent that he would scrape on road reflectors. Needless to say, he had to replace a lot of his suspension every year or so. Story 20, when I was in high school in Belgium. All the cool kids rode mopeds, since it's the only motorized vehicle we are allowed to drive under 18. This one kid got a brand new Honda before the start of winter, took it completely apart in order to clean it and put it back together. He completely degreased it, and it rusted and failed within weeks. Story 21, I worked at a Chevy dealer and now work at a Jaguar Land Rover dealer. I'm not surprised at people's stupidity anymore. More than once I've seen people add oil to the coolant reservoir. I've seen the inside of a motor where the customer never changed the oil since it was new and the car had 50 XXX miles on it. The dumbest thing I see every day is people come in with broke suspension parts, bald tires, and no brakes. They don't buy any of it and just want the oil change and insist we're trying to rip them off. But the same person will come in raising over a small safety recall and refuse to leave until it's done because the car's unsafe. Story 22, service advisor here. Hope it's okay. I post this. Had this happen a few months ago. It's a copy and paste from my FB, where I typically post stories like this. Customer brings in car last week Wednesday with shaking issue. Cool. Take care of some of the issues the car actually has. Leaves 10 times better issues include bad axles, TSB on diff, dirty transmission fluid, blown rear shocks, needing oil service, done and gone. We listed the recommendations still required, but customer declined. Only did axle and diff fluid service. Today, same customer. Over the phone, customer, what in fucking did you do to my CR? Me, what's the issue? Customer, the issue is back. And it's fucking 1000x worst. What the did I pay you for? Me, okay. Well, if it's our repair that caused the problem, we're more than willing to see what's going on. We didn't replicate anything after test drive. So unfortunately, we can't determine it's the same issue without checking it out. Customer, I demand a tow truck to be sent out, and you guys have to flip the bill on this. I'm not paying for this nonsense. Me, sir? Not a problem. If it is work we've done, we are happy to pay for the tow and correct the issues. But be advised, if the issue is due to the other recommendations or new issue, you will be responsible for the tow fee. Customer, yeah, that's fine. I know it's what you guys did anyway. Me, okie dokes. Tow truck will be there within the HR. Tow truck picks car up, notices issue, tells customer, notes it on receipt. Customer signs and acknowledges it, coming back to this in a second. Get car. Puncture on rear right outer tire sidewall. Nice welt and gash the size of a penny. Tire completely deflated tow. Driver noted this, told customer, and wrote it out and had customer sign it. Grab air hose, hook up a tire, just wheezing air out. Me, well then, me, yes sir. You had a flat tire and you were driving on it. Customer, nope. Not possible. It left here fine. I barely drove it home and it sat since I picked it up from you guys. Me, according to the receipt, you acknowledged the puncture with the tow truck driver and sign it off knowing it was flat, but we did install the spare, drove about 10 miles on street in FWY, and we cannot replicate the issue at this time. Can hear customer trying to find receipt. Hangs up guess who just paid $75.00 on a tow bill. Story 23, I had a guy bring his motor swapped late 80s F-150 in for some transmission work. These came factory with either a 300 straight 6, 351 V8, or 460 V8. He put two 3L carbureted 4-cylinder out of an old Ranger in it. The reasoning behind the swap was that it improved fuel mileage at the cost of some speed. The thing could barely move under its own power. If you floored it, it would top out at about 55 miles per hour, wide open, and take a good minute or two to get there. Story 24, my old mechanic had a guy come in with a Ford probe. He claimed it was low on oil. They take the dipstick out, and the whole stick is oil on it. He checks again with the same result. The guy took the oil cap off and looked down into the hole and said, see it as low he had put 3 to 4 cases of oil in the motor, trying to fill the entire block up. Story 25, definitely the customers that vajazzle their airbags. Just cut out the middleman and mount a live claymore on your dashboard. I wrench on bikes, not cars. And at least once a month we have someone come in that put chain lube or grease on their brake rotors because they were squealing and now wants to know why their brakes aren't grabbing. Story 26, new 5-speed Civic came back in with shifting problems. Car only had around 500 miles. Dad was with the son, screaming lemon law. I start looking it over and noticed the front tires had 232 worth of tread and the rears were brand new. Pull the shield off the trans and clutch fibers and pieces start falling out. Call the father and son out there to look at it. That kid probably got up when they got home, LOL. Story 27, a long time ago. The muffler of a friend's car developed a hole. Her husband split a Chocola can and duct taped it over the muffler. She later had to have some other work done and was going to go to the same repairman I used. Not only was this man an expert, he was an ex-stock car racer. He always had the greatest bunch of cronies around, but they did not suffer fools at all. I had heard some of their stories and had an idea what they would say if she drove in with that Chocola can. I pleaded with her for days to get rid of that, but she did not. I had to take my car in for service a week later, and man, were there comments. I passed them along, but she and her husband didn't see the humor. For years later, she was always referred to as my friend with the Chocola can. Story 28, my dad once poured wiper fluid into where the brake fluid goes. It was my relatively new car, so he wasn't familiar with it, and also clearly not paying attention. He tried to tell me it was probably fine, but I made him take it to a mechanic and pay to have it drained and fixed properly. I bet the mechanic had a good laugh that day. And my dad learned a fairly costly lesson about paying attention. Story 29, lady had a brand new at the time Subaru and was complaining about horrible gas mileage. People complain about gas mileage all the time, and it's usually because of driving habits. I get the car in, and it looked like she hit something in the road and ripped a big hole in the gas tank, and all the fuel she put in poured right out onto the pavement. It was in fact a valid poor fuel economy complaint after all. Story 30, not a mechanic. But while sitting in the shop waiting for my own car to have work completed, I witnessed a customer and their mechanic talking about the customer's car needing suspension repair. The customer had tried unsuccessfully to do the repair himself. The mechanic asked him why some lug nuts were missing and others were loose. The customer replied how he thought he would be helping the mechanic by loosening the tire for him. The customer had driven 20 minutes to get to the shop with a tire held on by a few loose lug nuts. Story 31, not a mechanic, but the first time I changed my own oil, I drained the engine oil and put the fresh oil in the transmission fluid dipstick. The truck made it 3 blocks, and I was lucky enough to not have seized anything. We'll never make that mistake again. Story 32, not a mechanic, but my boss he told me one of their customers lost 2 lug nuts when he was changing a flat tire. So the guy just globbed a load of JB Quick Weld where they used to be. Story 33, so many people hammer on battery terminal ends. The types of terminals have changed with modern vehicles, but people still don't understand that batteries are lead and plastic. Don't beat and hammer on that. You will destroy your brand new 100 battery. And no, there is no warranty if you smash it with a hammer. Story 34, not a mechanic except on my own cars. But even still, I've seen some dumb things come through my shop. The funnier one is when I installed a performance intercooler and intercooler tubing on my Mini, but I forgot to tighten down one of the hose clamps on a tube. The car ran fine for about half a day, but then I took it out at night and gave it the beans on a highway on-ramp. The full throttle air pressure in the tube caused it to pop off the intercooler. Immediately, the intake sensors went nuts and the dash lit up like crazy. Within seconds, the engine shut off while I was rolling about 60 miles per hour. I figured out what happened pretty quickly, of course. It's the idiot thing I did earlier today and was only a couple miles from home. So on the highway shoulder, I did what I thought was a quick fix without tools to make it the rest of the way home. I limped it off the highway onto a main boulevard. When I stopped at the first light, it turned green. I hit the gas, the pipe blew off again. The engine shut off again, except now I was right next to a very busy taco truck, and all the 30-ish people lined up and eating took notice. A few of them ran over to help me push it off the street and into the spot in front of the truck, being about a half mile from home. I did the same fix as before, lying down in front of the car and reaching up into the engine bay to force the tube back onto the intercooler, giving it a few extra runs to get it in place more securely. Everyone was watching me do this now, having seen my car randomly die in traffic, watch me get help pushing it over, then without a second's hesitation, diving down in front of it, blindly reaching up into the dark engine bay and jerking things around like some supernatural car whisperer. People were crowding around, asking if I needed help. I just got back up and hit the ignition, and it started right up, Everyone laughed and cheered as I pulled back out into traffic to get home, where I could really fix it, despite me being an idiot. For that moment when I fixed it in front of a group of random strangers, I felt special. Then there was the time I replaced the water pump and didn't tighten down a ground wire tight enough on reassembly. It drove fine on the way to work, but the wire shook itself free and the battery died while I was at work. Was able to push start on my way home, but the electronics kept acting crazy, headlights dimming and dashboard losing functionality even though the engine was running fine. Made it home and checked everything and found a loose ground, but in the morning the car wouldn't start again. I had killed the battery and in the process also blown out some chip for the security system immobilizer. So even after replacing the battery, it wouldn't start. Had to get that fixed by some other mechanic who might show up in this thread talking about the idiot who tried fixing his Mini. The reason I started teaching myself to fix and break my own cars was long ago. I took my Volvo into a dealer for service, and the mechanic didn't screw the cap for the coolant back on after flushing it. I got halfway through a 600-mile drive in the middle of a blizzard in January, and the car started overheating. Opened the hood and saw boiling coolant spouting up out of the reservoir. The mechanic had left the coolant cap beneath the hood cowl, the top part where the wipers go underneath the hood, and amazingly it was still resting there. Let the car cool down, and the reservoir was basically empty, so I stuffed some freshly fallen snow into it and made the rest of the drive with the heat blasting. The heat was so hot in the cabin, I had to have the windows down on the highway in 20-degree temperatures just to make sure I got there without overheating again. That's when I decided to poorly fix my own cars instead of paying someone else to poorly fix them. First thing I did was replace the coolant again. Story 35. I'm a Subaru dealership tech, so I see a fair share of questionable mods. I think the hentai WRX that visits frequently is probably the most WTF worthy. Guy put hentai stickers on all the windows, plate frame, etc. Also seen a lot of dumb shifter replacements like sword handles and stuff. But as I also frequently browse, we're just rolled in a Theship, and this type of post is by far the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Story 36 guy was convinced his tires were different sizes because they were rotating at different rates, like he jacked up each wheel and put the valve stem at the top. Went for a drive, and they were not lined up anymore. I had to explain it with chalk and string in the parking lot. Story 37 had a mechanic friend of mine tell me one customer didn't know that the oil would need to be replaced every few thousand. They just assumed that the maintenance minder was to remind them to check the levels and look under their car to make sure it wasn't leaking. They thought that all the oil for people to buy was because either the oil would leak or evaporate out of the engine. Mechanic friend surprised Pikachu. Story 38, the worst one I've seen, actually ended up being on a motorcycle I bought. At some point the chain snapped or came off somehow and got lodged between the front sprocket and the engine case and punched a hole in the case. The owner, JB, welded a piece of license plate over the hole as a patch, but didn't give her enough to actually dig out the case pieces. I never noticed it because on top of the license plate patch, he glued a black piece of plastic that the front sprocket cover slid into and looked perfectly stock. I rode that bike a lot, and it was fine for a while, but I was on a trip with it about 100 miles from home when it overheated and died. I limped it home, but just barely. I pulled the engine, and that's when I found it. I pulled the lower pan off, and there were chunks of aluminum floating in the oil the size of coins. One was about too big. The oil pump pickup was completely impacted with aluminum and blocked. The gears inside the pump were destroyed. The bearings were worn almost completely through, and the cams were destroyed. It blew the head gasket when it overheated. It was... Story 39, not a mechanic, but those stickers which say powered by fairy dust in the Disney font really sicken me. They're so ubiquitous around here. There are even edgy spin-offs, such as the incredibly cringy powered by dust. Story 40, about 20 years ago, I worked in an oil change shop in northern Illinois. This one day, this red Camaro pulls up with some Florida plates on it. The woman gets out of the car and says she's passing through town on her way to Milwaukee and that the engine kind of has a knock to it, and it's not accelerating very quickly. I'm hoping it just needs an oil change, so I start the pre-oil change service filling washer fluids, checking brake fluid, power steering, etc., and decided to pull the dipstick just to see how the oil looks. Nothing on the dipstick. I wonder if maybe her car maybe has a leak. I pull the car onto the lift, and man, is that engine running. Not right. So I raise the car to start service, and everything underneath looks absolutely pristine. No sign of any leaks. I'm noticing that the oil filter looks like the factory filter. Now, the car has like 25,000 miles on it, so I assume she had just been taking it to the dealership for services. Then I opened the drain plug. Anyone who's ever worked in an oil change shop knows that the oil in a brand new car is a heavier weighted oil with a kind of green-brown color. So that's what I'm seeing. I put a finger into the flow to look a little more closely at the oil in the light. Sure enough, it's factory oil. Not only was it factory oil, but there's enough little metal shavings in it that it may as well have been glitter oil. So I go show the woman and say, well, part of the problem is that you for sure didn't have enough oil in it. The other problem is that whoever did your last oil change put in the heavy grade factory oil. You really don't want that in your engine any more than 3,000 miles. She looks shocked and says to me, this is going to be this car's first oil change. I didn't know you were supposed to change it so soon after you buy it. So yeah, woman goes out and spends $45,000 on a car and has no idea you're supposed to change the oil every 3,000 miles. Not once every 30,000 miles. I know that after I finished the service and pulled it out of the shop, it seemed to be running a lot better, but I have no idea what ever came of that car or that woman. Story 41, not a mechanic. However, I have story for this. Some years ago, here where I live, there was a fairly widespread craze of mixing oil. I don't remember the type, but it wasn't at all related with the engine like sunflower oil or something like that with diesel for better fuel consumption. The thought was that this type of oil would burn anyway, and mixed with diesel, it would give the same kilometers for less money. Of course, it wasn't the brightest of ideas, so I remember that despite being fairly young, I remember strongly advising against this practice. My mother didn't listen to me, and proceeded to top her Mitsubishi Pajero Turbo Great car for fuel economy. I know with whatever oil she used. Now, to be fair, the car held up pretty well despite the abuse, which is because it was a tank. However, it eventually succumbed. If I remember correctly, the fuel pump completely failed and had to be replaced entirely, but I might be forgetting stuff. The funny thing is, though, that the mechanic, after looking at the engine for about 3 minutes or something like that, asked almost angrily to my mother if she was using the oil. When questioned how he knew that, he said something along the line of, it's the fourth this week that comes in with this issue. Story 42, not what someone has done to their car. But at my school, we take auto maintenance and light repair. I was with a kid who put on a tire machine and broke the bead without taking the air out, resulting in a loud boom and a tire and rim flying. Kid got suspended. Story 43, cousin of mine, said that he needed brake pads. He pulled up, obviously using the e-brake to make the car come to a stop. Said he'd been using the e-brake to stop for a few days. I started taking the rotor off, and it was so thin and worn it fell off in 4 pieces. Ended up having to replace all pads, rotors, and calipers. Story 44 had a guy show up at a tire shop bragging about being blackout drunk and needed his tire changed. He had a spare on with 35 lug nuts. He had tightened them by hand, and they backed off. Had to replace all the studs. Folks would come in asking for tire repairs patches on tires that were literally cut in half. Like you drove on the rim for a week split down the middle in half. They get so offended when I explained they not only needed a tire, but now a rim as well. I've seen a fake intercooler on a Sunfire, paper mache used instead of Bondo. The list goes on. Story 45, not a mechanic, but a parts runner. I had seen pimped up cars that should not run, and others look like a manor on wheels. One of the dumbest was the classic Pimp Mobile. A 2010 Jeep Grand Cherokee, neon purple, fake leopard upholstery. Steering wheel was supposed to look like golden chains, and the internal work made no sense. They needed brakes and wheel wells, but the mechanics working on it were laughing every time they went near it. By the end, I had to deliver brakes, wheel well, battery, axles, and an engine block. Story 46 lady stated that her car said low coolant, so she filled up the coolant. She made about a mile, and the car started running terrible and cut off. Shop rollback picked it up. She filled up the coolant by removing the oil cap and topping the motor off with water. Story 47 mechanic here. Lots of stories. One guy is OCD and got a license plate called Too Clean. Only let one guy in our shop touch his base model Dodge Dakota, 2007. Had a double up on gloves, and he would watch. Under-sprayed his car with chrome spray. I work primarily on equipment. Operator calls us out to his machine, saying he had a crack on his boom. Think the first arm on a large excavator. I get out there, and the whole boom is broken off and is on the ground. My favorite, though, had to be the operator who blew a hydraulic hose in a forestry setting, maybe 200 to change the hose. Decided he wants to walk the machine out to make the hose easier and runs the machine out of oil. Blowing up the hydraulic pumps, 26,000. 2 travel motors, 8,000 each, and the auxiliary pump, 2,500-ish. The machine was down for 2 months for him, deciding to walk an extra 50 meters out of the bush, so he didn't have to walk the extra distance. I have tons of stories about lazy operators, but this is probably the laziest, LOL. Story 48 best friend growing up had an old 78 Chevy Custom Deluxe 34-ton truck. Every door was a different color, half of it was rusted out, and half the time it wouldn't even start. He ended up putting custom chrome 10 exhaust tips on it that cost 5x as much as the truck was worth. Why, now it sounds